welcome back to the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One here on the Overtime Media Network. The Marks here, Mark Daly and Mark Hamilton, coming to you again for the final race of the year. Mark, can you believe it? This 2020 has just been, just in general, like a very bizarre, the weirdest and most disturbing year of all. But the fact that we are now here, like literally just 2 weeks before Christmas, we're coming up to the last race of the year that's only a week or two behind schedule, considering we started at the beginning of July, is a bit of it's blowing my mind a little bit. And, honestly, I'm not ready for the season to end, despite the fact that the World Championship was decided weeks ago. I don't want the season to end. I've actually enjoyed it quite a bit.
Yeah, this season has been, given what it could have been where we were back in March when we were at the Australian Grand Prix in Melbourne, and you and I've talked about this so much, what Liberty has managed to do in terms of constructing a schedule basically out of thin air, incorporating venues and logistics and resources that we never in a million years would have imagined they'd have been able to parse into the season. It's been phenomenal. And you say as well that you're not ready for the season to end. Well, when you consider that the season is ending so late, and you consider that we're going to pack in a 23 race season next year, this offseason is going to feel absurdly slow. When you factor in winter testing, when you factor in all the craziness that is the offseason and driver signings and changes and all those kind of pieces, this offseason is going to fly by, and we are going to be in Melbourne before you know it.
Yeah, the thing is too, I was thinking about it this afternoon, because there was a story that came out that they're talking about having like the F1 COVID bubble still in place for the Australian Grand Prix in March. And I was thinking, normally when you get to this point of the point of the season, you wrap it up, when you get to Abu Dhabi, you've got this long off season ahead of you, because typically we don't get to winter testing to about Valentine's Day, middle of February, right? And that 2 month block seems like a ridiculously long and just an unreasonably long amount of time for any Formula One fan, but it goes really, really quickly. And considering just, I don't know about I know, like I was just saying just now, that this has been the most trying and difficult of the year that has been experienced in a long, long time. But it's been weird when you think about it. I mean, at times 2020 is dragged. Like a week in normal time seems to be a week like in dog years. It seems to feel really, really long. But then just when you look at the bigger picture, it seems like this year has also gone on at a very, very rapid pace. So I was thinking that even though we're only, we think about it, we're in December now, we're 4 months away from the first Grand Prix again, and it will go really, really quickly. And I can see that makes a lot of sense that they're going to have that COVID bubble in place, because we're getting the good news now that vaccines are getting approved for emergency use in different countries around the world. Canada was one. I think they had the discussions with the FDA down in the States today, and they've recommended. So there is a glimmer of hope that we might be taking the first tentative small steps towards, coming to the end of this whole COVID thing. But, like you say, it is amazing to think that they were able to cobble together this schedule from nothing, because when you think about it, that even though we had to set back the start of the season 3 or 4 months to get going, and we've had a lot of these double and triple header weekends, I don't really feel that the season felt any shorter, despite the fact that we were going to have 22 this year, right? So we basically lost 5 races, but despite that, I still feel like it was a full schedule.
It's funny you say that, because I come to that same kind of thought quite often when, like, okay, you know what, the season's wrapping up in Abu Dhabi, we had this conventional schedule, and then I have to think back, like, really, that's not what it was at all. The season really didn't kick off until the summer. And to your point, we had that 3 or 4 month gap after kind of that aborted start in Melbourne, where we were uncertain what the calendar was going to look like. Were we going to have a calendar at all? How modified was it going to be? How many races were we going to have? But it really does feel like we had an entire calendar's worth of action and drama and excitement. And I think the one thing that I keep going back to as well is that, like a lot of sports leagues, so we're in North America, so we're exposed to the NFL and Major League Baseball and the NBA and things like that. There was a lot of concern, and I think from a media kind of analyst perspective, there was a lot of questions about whether these COVID seasons would have that asterisk next to them. Like, what was this a real season? Was it significantly compromised by infection, by teams having to forfeit and skip and reschedule games and things like that. But I think, we've had a couple of hiccups. We know Lance missed a race, and Sergio missed a couple of races, and now Lewis has missed a race. But I really don't think that was consequential in terms of determining what the outcome of the championship was going to be. And I think, it was a shorter schedule, but it was compact. There was a lot of double headers. There was a lot of triple headers. I think there was some incredible racing despite everything. And I think some of the tracks as well lost a little bit of their atmosphere. Even when we're sitting at home, it's tough to watch a race when you have hundreds of thousands of seats in the grandstands that are empty. But that said, I still think that the action and the spectacle on the track really made up for a lot of that. And I really credit Liberty and their partners at Sky Sports for really creating a compelling product despite all of those kind of existential challenges that they encountered this season. And for me, and I keep going to this, I don't think for a second that there's an asterisk next to this calendar. In fact, I give Lewis extra credit for winning this championship. This is a season where the drivers and the teams had to kind of fight off all the challenges of a conventional season, which is travel and being away from family, and all the grinds of being on the road for extended periods of times. And then you compress that into the fact that there was double headers and triple headers, which is incredibly difficult on the teams, and something that I think the teams fought really hard to try to eliminate through the Concord Agreement, although maybe next year's calendar proves that they weren't quite so successful. But I would really credit the teams and the drivers for being able to compete this season, and doing so despite everything that was going on outside, and the fact that they were able to have a championship that was really free of those question marks that maybe some of the other sports were impacted by. And I credit Liberty, and I credit the drivers and the teams and the constructors, because I think they really did put together a compelling product. And at the end of the day, for me, not only is there not an asterisk next to this championship, I give Lewis extra credit for winning in spite of everything that was going on, especially a driver of his age. Competing a triple header, it's a grind for me to get up to watch a race 3 weekends in a row, to travel and be in those locations and be isolated from your friends and your family and not be able to get away. I think we forget sometimes as well that for these drivers, they might be competing in a double or triple header, but between race weekends, they're able to get in that private jet, they're able to get in that first class seat, fly away to some tropical destination, spend a couple of days with their friends, reset, come back for the next race weekend. That wasn't the case. These drivers were living elbow to elbow with the mechanics and the engineers and the teams, bunkered down in these bubbles to make sure that they could protect themselves and be able to compete weekend to weekend. But I think all things considered, this was a phenomenal.
Yeah, absolutely. And the one image that popped into my mind when you said that, despite the fact that we had these races, that there were some things missing, like the atmosphere, immediately what pops to mind is we had 3 races in Italy this year: Monza, Mugello, and in Imola. And there was not a single Tifosi. I mean, some of them, there were like a handful of fans at some of these races. But I mean, especially at Monza, you expect the stands to be packed with people. Well, I mean, this is not a Ferrari a sweater, but you expect to see the scarlet clad Tifosi there. You expect to see them with the Ferrari flags and things like that. Same thing at Silverstone. We had a double header at Silverstone. I mean, that is like Lewis Mania Central. And then the same thing at tracks like Spa and Red Bull Ring. I mean, easy driving distance relatively for all the Dutch fans. I mean, when I lived in Holland, we used to go to Austria and France and countries like that to go skiing. So I mean, it is easy to jump in the car to go to Germany, go to Austria, go to Belgium. If you're a fan of Max Verstappen, you're in the Netherlands, you're there in a couple of hours. And it really, despite we've had races at all these wonderful tracks, it has been strange to see, the lack of fans there. I know we've had fans in attendance at some of them, but certainly it doesn't take away from watching at home, but it does look strange when you're sitting at home watching, just to see them do lap after lap, especially in those early season races and some of the ones we've had recently where the facilities have been closed off, and you just see some of these big banners that they have up in the grandstands. But that notwithstanding, I still think that the fact that they were able to come up with the system, and like you say, apart from a few small hiccups, it has worked really well. And I'm glad to hear that Lewis has tested negative. Pardon me, I don't wrong thing here. They has tested negative for COVID. He will be back at Yas Marina for the season finale this weekend. And I mean, that was every time there has been positive tests come back, you know, for, like you said, for Lance, for Sergio, and then for Lewis. I mean, we all knew that these things were going to happen. It was just expected that somebody would test positive along the way. But thank goodness it did not happen, say 3 months ago or something like that. And say Lewis missed an extended period of time, because we would be sitting here right now saying, you know, having a completely different conversation. I mean, in that case, well, yeah, I mean, say Max or Valtteri or somebody else wins the championship. Sure, they were there, they won all the races, they got all the points they needed to win the championship. But then you think, well, I mean, Lewis never missed a race in his career before last weekend. And you just have to think, yeah, if Lewis had been in the car, it would have been a completely different situation. So, I mean, from that point of view, yes, it was obviously, unfortunate that he tested positive. Fortunately, he didn't get very sick. Fortunately, he's back this weekend. But also, fortunately, it didn't detract from or impact the championship in a negative way, because, like you said, there could be a big old asterisk beside 2020, like we've seen in other areas. But we're going to wrap it up this weekend, but before we do that, there is a ton of news to go over this this week. And well, we're coming up in a break in about 5 or 6 minutes, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this a little bit more. I mean, we have to talk about it. You can't avoid it. It is the elephant in the room. And this is this whole situation with Nikita Mazepin, the newly confirmed Haas driver coming in for 2021. That announcement only dropped a week ago. It is Thursday night, December 10th, 2020, here on the west coast of North America. So we sat down here a week ago to do the weekly show, the regular weekly show, and we talked about how they'd confirmed Mazepin and Mick Schumacher for 2021 as their drivers. Less than a week later, you have Mazepin put this video up on his Instagram, and then it's rapidly deleted. But the internet does what the internet always does, and it was quickly downloaded and saved and shared. And I'm honestly quite number one. I can't say I'm surprised, sadly, just based on his track record. I think we have an idea of what he's like so far, Nikita Mazepin, and it's I don't want to say it's expected, but it's extremely disappointing that it happened at all, and it happened so quickly. And I mean, I think we have a good idea what his character is like now. And unfortunately, I think when it comes to him, at the very best case scenario, he's got some serious growing up to do. And a worst case scenario is obviously a lot worse than maturity issues. I mean, we don't need to really get into the the really descriptive part of the video. If you want to go search it up, you can go find out a blurred out version on Reddit and places like that. But basically, what it comes to is he's in a car with one of his dude bro friends, and there's a girl in the back of the car. There's some inappropriate things going on. He shares it to his his Instagram story, and of course, it's going to get shared. And I mean, it is just that is obviously terrible behavior. But what's even more frustrating and disappointing is just the subsequent reaction from Haas, the FAA, and Formula One. It's just basically a bunch of negative statements that we do not condone this action. It's abhorrent behavior, which of course it is. But in the new We Races One era in Formula One, it sets such a bad example. We saw earlier this year a Formula E driver get fired for cheating in a sim racing environment. Really? So I mean, you can get fired for getting your buddy to come in and race in place of you in like a sim race, like for esports, but you can go and sexually assault somebody as a Formula One driver, and the worst that happens is just like a bunch of PR releases and things like that. And the fact that Gunther Steiner, team principal at Haas, was addressing the media again, saying that we're dealing with internally and we're not going to make address it anymore publicly. Just to me is just the worst possible reaction that we can have. So to me, the whole We Race is one thing seems to be, well, if you're a driver of questionable ability and questionable morals, you seem to be included under the We Races One banner, when obviously that stands or should stand for something completely different.
You know what? I think I might go on a little bit long, and you know what? You made a great point before we even started this podcast, which is how much airtime do we want to devote to this kid? I just think we do a disservice to the community and to the sport if we don't challenge F1 on some of their decisions, right? Because one of the concerns that I've always had about Formula One is I feel like the traveling media, the traveling press, the traditional media that travels with the sport and they go to every race, my sense is that they've been very much ingrained within the sports. They're very insular. And I think sometimes for fear of losing access, they're not as critical of the teams and the drivers and the decisions at the FIA in Formula One as they should be, because ultimately they're afraid of losing access. And access is their gravy train. It's what gets them a paycheck. Having that interview with a Daniel Ricciardo or Lewis Hamilton is important to them. And if they're too, I would say, frisky, or they create too much friction in their reporting, they'll lose that access. And I was really curious to see how the F1 media stable was ultimately going to respond to this incident. And, you know, you and I were talking a couple nights ago, because I actually encountered this situation on Reddit before it had appeared in any tabloid or in the F1 media. I saw it in Reddit. But you know what? I know we need to cut to a break. Maybe we cut to a break real quick, and then we can pick this up.
Sure, let's do that. Let's break ahead of schedule here on the Overtime Media Network. Don't go away. We'll be back in just a moment. All right. Well, welcome back to the show. The podcast is always up to speed on Formula One. And of course, we're not just on podcasts. Podcast's not your thing. Go and search us up on YouTube. If YouTube isn't your thing, come back. We're on Apple. We're on Spotify. We're everywhere you can get your podcast. But Mark, we were just talking about the whole Nikita Mazepin situation before the break. And just to follow up on your point, I don't think that sometimes maybe the and I don't want to be too overly critical of the media. I understand that, but it's not a phenomena to really go out on a limb in situations like this, or to be overly critical, or really be, I'm not even sure what the correct word is. I've seen that before, like in the soccer media as well. And I've seen people have, incidents with, governing bodies, different clubs for saying the wrong thing on a podcast, on TV, on social media, or writing or printing something that landed them in a little bit of hot water. So, there is that very fine line to tread as a journalist, where you want to go out there, because I mean, your duty is to cover the stories, the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? But, it's just like, and that's the problem that some of these people have is, especially now, and well, I don't think it's any different now than it was at any point in the past. But, if you do the wrong thing or say the wrong thing, I mean, you could quickly find yourself, with your credentials revoked, and all of a sudden you're on the outside looking in.
Absolutely.
For us, it's different. We're not doing this for our 9 to 5. This is not our bread and butter. We're not making a living off of this. But I can understand that in certain, it doesn't matter. I mean, which sport it is. I mean, it's a very, very real, dilemma, ethical dilemma. It's just like, when you have a situation like this, what do I say? What do I write? What do I do? And where do I draw that line?
I think one of the things that we're really fortunate of, and I think the F1 media is fortunate about, is the fact that the grid, for the most part, for the better part of the last decade, has been populated by some really great people. Like you look at the racers, these are great people. They're charismatic, they're personable, they're approachable, they're media savvy. And you and I have talked so much the last couple of weeks about this. The current influx of this younger generation is social media savvy, and they're charismatic, and they're outgoing, and they're accessible. Like, they're all the things that you would want a young driver to be. And I think the F1 media, as a result, has kind of been blessed, because they've inherited this pool of drivers that are everything you would want them to be from a media perspective. And I think their behavior on, for the most part, and off the track has been such that we really haven't had to have any really deep dive critical investigations and analysis of the behavior of the drivers, because, again, they're good guys. You know what? Daniel Ricciardo, in the offseason, he goes home to Western Australia, and he goes dirt biking, and he goes swimming. And you know what? Lewis is working on his music and his fashion label. Like, these are great, wholesome drivers who have some really, really pure interests. And I think that's where this is so troublesome, because it was a week ago where you and I were talking about the exciting driver lineup component at Haas, which is Mick Schumacher driving the team. And we were also very critical of the decision to bring in Nikita Mazepin. And we listed a long list of some of his transgressions. And it's funny, because after that podcast, I was like, you know what? I'm thinking, he's a young kid. He's made some bad decisions. A lot of this was in the past. you know, maybe he's grown up. And I was certain that when they were sitting in negotiations to bring him onto Haas and represent Haas and to represent Ferrari and represent Formula One, that they would have really laid down the law and said, look, you know what, contractually, here's the things you can do. Here's the things you can't do. We're going to take away your phone. We're going to disable your Instagram account, or we're going to get you a publicist and you run everything through your publicist. But not even a week later, ultimately, possibly his worst social media transgression ever. And this is a guy who's defended racist, has made a homophobic comment towards George Russell. Like it's mind-boggling that this was able to happen, and the fact that it happened as well in a strict conservative Islamic country, in a luxury car, and like again, at the end of the day, as far as I'm concerned, it was sexual assault is what it was. Mm-hmm. There's no two ways around it. And I think as a father now, and you've been a father for a number of years, and I've been a father for a couple of years, I interpret these things a little bit differently because I want to nurture my son and I want him to grow up being a Formula One fan, but I don't know how I can motivate him to be a fan of the sport when 5% of the drivers, or one of the 20 drivers on the grid, is this type of personality. Like, why would I want to continue investing my hard-earned money in the F1 TV Pro app and to buy tickets to go to races when really I'm just condoning this type of behavior? Mm-hmm. And maybe one of the reasons it's so galling is just because so many of the drivers on the grid are just such great guys. And it is funny too, one of the things that I saw, the tide that kind of shifted on social media and Reddit this week, is a lot of fans have been critical of Lance and they've been critical of Latifi. And that's not because they're not great people, because they're great Canadian kids and they're polite and they're friendly, and they're genuine and they're authentic. But people have been critical of them because, you know what, they're that quote unquote labeled as a pay driver, that they bring money to the team with them, and that's okay. But in Mazepin's case, he's absolutely bringing money. But the fear is, and I think the backlash from the fans is, you know what, the treatment of Mazepin is different than maybe another driver because his family is bringing tens of millions of dollars to a team that might otherwise not be on the grid. So, you know what, you and I talked a lot about this the night kind of the story broke on social media. We waited eagerly to see how it was going to kind of be dealt with the next day. And the tabloids obviously were all over it because it was a scandal. And some of this more traditional F1 media picked it up. Haas was quick to release a statement, and I think you and I were both very disappointed. I don't want to speak for you, but the language was very much, hey, this was an abhorrent behavior, but we're going to deal with it internally. So then it's like, well, if they're going to deal with it internally, that means we're probably never going to hear what actually happened. They're not going to financially penalize him. They're not going to take away his race seat. It's really up to the Formula One and the FIA to come out now and take a strong stance on this, maybe suspend his super license for a year or something like that. But Formula One and the FIA ultimately came out in a joint announcement and basically said, hey, we support Haas. We support that they want to deal with this internally and that we're not going to hear anything more about it publicly. So as far as I'm concerned, the issue as far as Haas is concerned is put to bed, and he's going to be at winter testing and he's going to be on the grid come Melbourne, which is a little bit disappointing. Well, a lot disappointing to me.
Yeah, it's just I kept another thing that popped up in my mind was a situation that happened a number of years ago, and some of you might know I've mentioned it before that one of the things I've done is I've covered the Vancouver Whitecaps football club in Major League Soccer for a number of years. And there was a situation, this is going back probably 2010, 2011, their first year in Major League Soccer. Okay, MLS is not Formula One. It's not the Premier League in terms of stature and coverage and things like that. But, you know, it is a pro sports league. It gets a lot of coverage in the respective cities and things like that. And of course, the Whitecaps are not Manchester United or Real Madrid or Barcelona or any one of those clubs, but still, these are all professional athletes. They all have a job to do. And there was an incident, about 9-10 years ago, whatever it was, when they first came into MLS, that one of their players got onto social media, tweeted out a homophobic slur about an opponent, and the Whitecaps, you know, they've had their issues over the years, and a lot of them have not gone over very well with the fan base. But this was one incident that they were absolutely spot on. They severed ties with that player and cut him from the roster right away because, you know, this, you know, person, you know, tweeted out like an extremely offensive term about somebody, and that was the correct way to do it. So to see something on the scale of like Formula One, to see that with the driver, that you know, and to see the reaction is, you know, underwhelming and disappointing and maddening at the very, very best. I mean, what I can hope for is that, they've sat down with him and his agents and everyone and said, okay, this is the only time that it's going to happen. And then, like you say, like, hopefully they have like a publicist and everything like that. They take the phone away from him.
Yeah.
He can't press the trigger on this stuff like that. I mean, that's not to say that, the egregious and bad behavior is still happening, somewhere behind closed doors, but what do you do? It's just, it's unfortunate, and it just casts such a bad light on other things. And that's the one thing that I found too, like, in all the years I've covered soccer, it's like 99% of the people that you interact with the players, coaches, staff, front office personnel, TV personnel, like everyone behind the scenes, they're all great people. They're all there for the right reasons. But every once in a while, there's one player in the dressing room that is just a bad apple, and you hear the stories, and or something that's that and it leaves such a bad taste in your mouth, and it really makes you kind of like rethink things. It's like, why is this person even here? Does it really just come down to the fact that this person has talent and they just help you win soccer games or Formula One races and things like that? And it is just it's something that it never sits right, and unfortunately these things pop up from time to time. And I just hope that this is the only time that it happens, and hopefully, should it happen again, that it's not dealt with in such because the perception is in the public that it's been brushed off and kind of swept over to one.
Absolutely.
And I think that is the worst possible thing. I mean, of course, they're going to kind of circle the wagons, Formula One and the FIA, if they, Haas has dealt with it. Who knows what's happened behind doors? But from a public perception point of view, it's just not a good look, I'm afraid.
I completely agree with everything that you said.
Yeah. Well, like we said before the break, we didn't want to give too much coverage to it. I think we've said all we really need to say on it. So why don't we go ahead now and take a look at some of the news that's been going around. And, there's been quite a bit of Ferrari news in the over the past couple of days. And one of them that was actually very, very surprising is that their CEO, Louis Camilleri, has actually announced his retirement from Ferrari effective immediately. And this is a bit of a bit of a shock, because he's been in the top spot there since 2018, ever since Sergio Marchionne fell ill and sadly passed away. He's helped them, solidify and grow their road card business, despite all the problems that economically that have been had recently because of coronavirus. And I'm sure that everybody's kind of watching their their spending habits, even if it's for luxury cars. But more than that, I mean, he's been a big supporter of the Formula One program, of the Formula One team. He's regularly in contact with team principal Mattia Binotto. He shows up quite often to the races. He's in the pits, in the garage there. So this is kind of a bit of a shock, and it is what it is. I mean, he's obviously not there driving the car, or, making the design decisions, or, making the decisions on the pit wall. But still, you can't help but think that when you have somebody that's that high up in the organization, that has, especially a big backer of the Formula One team like that, that it can't impact them in some way.
Yeah, I think the thing that caught me most off guard about this was less necessarily that it happened, but more the timing. Like my sense is that this wasn't necessarily his timetable. And I don't want to speculate too much, but I have some deeply seated suspicion that organizationally and structurally we'll probably see some changes at Ferrari in the offseason. I think ultimately, to disrupt the team with significant personnel and executive changes during a season that is already impacted by COVID probably wasn't necessarily the right thing to do. But I think as we inch closer and closer to the offseason, especially with the regulation changes coming in 2022 and the new Concord agreement, I think this is the team that maybe has an appetite to reset a little bit. And I think the other consideration too is as the world shifts into a global recession, and I guess in many ways we're already there, you have to assume that the appetite for supercars, which has been very, very hungry the past 15 or 20 years, as the globe has kind of churned on, and we've seen these emerging industrialized states emerge, like the PRC and places like that. you have to think that Ferrari's probably looking at their bottom line a little bit more closely than they have in the past. And this is a company that produces a limited assortment of high dollar luxury cars, but they generate virtually all of the revenue and the operating income for this company. But ultimately, yeah, for me, and not to kind of go too far down that kind of economics path, it was the timing for me that just seems so suspect. If this is something that you want to do, why not wait until after Yas Marina? Why not wait another week? Why not let the season breathe a little bit and do it when the press has kind of died down and people have scattered around Europe for the holidays? Like, it was just very suspicious, the timing. And again, like I said, I don't want to speculate too much, but I suspect it's the tip of the iceberg in terms of some major structural changes within that organization.
Well, like you say, I mean, it was very strange the way that they restructured like the racing team during the year, and just and it seemed very odd. It's like, okay, why are you doing this?
Exactly.
You had 3 or 4 months enforced time off, and you had ample time to sit back. And you had the factory shut down, but you could still probably meet via Zoom or Teams or whatever that we all do in 2020, and decide, okay, well, Matia's focusing too much on this, but he should be focusing more on there. So, let's make these decisions now. So to announce it sort of partway through this already modified season was extremely bizarre, but also the fact that they don't have an immediate replacement lined up, is even stranger. So that'll certainly be a situation to watch over the weeks and months ahead. But speaking of Mattia Binotto, he recently decided to skip a race in person and actually stay back at the factory in Maranello and observe and participate from there. He's actually not going to be at the race this weekend in Abu Dhabi because he's actually sick. He got sick in Bahrain. He's flown back to Italy. He doesn't have COVID. He's got something else, so he's going to be handing over his duties to their sporting director instead. But it just seems to be a continuation of I mean, it seems every single bump that they could have hit along the way this year, Ferrari seems to have, they've had these issues, on the track, off the track, with the drivers, with the car, with the people on the pit wall in the garage. It has not been an easy season. Glad to hear that he doesn't have COVID. Hopefully it's nothing more serious than some just a simple illness that'll just play itself out over the next several days, and it's not indication of another underlying situation or illness or something like that. But Charles, now moving back onto the track, Charles Leclerc said that he's decided he's going to choose his fights better after that incident last week at the Sakira Grand Prix, when you had basically himself, Checo Perez, and Max Verstappen going, abreast, 3 a line into turn 4, and of course, Max saw the little light flash off in his head at first, and decided to ease out of that. But sorry, getting all the names jumbled here. But Charles decided he saw a bit of daylight, decided to slide up the inside there, even after Checo was still coming all the way across, and that triggered that first lap incident. And it still just amazes me that despite that, that incident, I mean, Charles, his race was over, Max's race was over because he got onto the gravel and crashed into the tire barrier. But that notwithstanding, that that bit of momentary mental lapse from Charles, and the fact that it also impacted Sergio, was that he, despite at the end of that lap, that he still comes back and he wins that race. I mean, I think that I have a lot of appreciation, a lot of admiration for the way that Sergio was able to do in that race, but I don't think I've fully been able to really appreciate it 100% to the magnitude of that accomplishment, considering he ended up at the back of the running order and still managed to win that race. So just absolutely phenomenal stuff. But it is kind of funny too. I think that despite the talent that Charles Leclerc obviously has, that we do seem to every once in a while see these I don't want to say it's immaturity, but maybe just the fact that he's still a young driver and is still got a little ways to go and to learn. I still go back to the mistake that he made last year in qualifying at Baku when he put it into the wall, just going around. I mean, of course, it's a very narrow opening when they go around behind the castle there, but the fact he gets on to the radios, oh, I'm so stupid. I mean, sometimes I think that just the passion and then the enthusiasm he has just gets a little bit the best of him. And I think we saw that with Max a couple of years ago when he had that that unfortunate incident where he crashed his car in, what was it, FP3 in Monaco, and then he ended up at the back of the grid, and then he took that time away before he went to Canada. And he went to Canada without his usual entourage, without his dad and everybody else. And that was that real, I think, one of those benchmark moments for Max, where I think that mentally a little switch went off in his head, and Max has been a lot more consistent, and he's been a better driver, more mature, more complete. And I think Charles sometimes, as good as he is, he just isn't quite there in the same place. So, I think he needs a bit of a moment like Max does. Whatever that moment, whatever shape or form it takes, I think he just needs that little bit of a wake-up call just to nudge him in the right direction.
I really like Charles, and I don't disagree with any of the things that you're saying, but I would say the one major distinction between he and maybe, and I think it's probably an apt comparison just because from an age perspective, they're both pretty comparable. They had similar successes in the lower formulas, but I think one of the biggest distinctions between he and Max is when Charles typically makes a mistake, and that Baku one is seared into my mind, and it's seared into my mind because he absolutely owned the error. And I think he was heartbroken for the team because in that moment, and you're right, it's an extremely narrow passage up that cobblestone kind of street past the castle. But I think he recognized in the moment that this is my mistake, but the consequence is that my team is going to spend the better part of the night in the garage rebuilding that car. And I think from Max's perspective, I think he's authentic, but I don't think he's as quick to take ownership of the mistakes that he does make. And I'm not suggesting he's deflecting or pointing in other directions. I just think it's a characteristic of Charles that he's going to own these mistakes, where Max will internalize them a little bit, take them away. And maybe he does feel that way, but he's not going to outwardly verbalize that to the masses. The one other comment too, as well, and I don't want to flash back because it makes for a choppy podcast for the poor listeners, but you made some really great points about Mattia. And I think the only other thing to kind of comment on that is his professional relationship with Sebastian Vettel is now effectively over, right? Mattia had actually flown into Yas, into Abu Dhabi, recognized he was ill. Like you said, fortunately, he didn't test positive for COVID, but it was the right thing to do to get him out of there, evacuate and get him back to Italy, get him back to the factory. But he actually made some really interesting comments this week that in light of the incredibly rich, deep calendar that we're going to see next year, that he and some of his peers may strategically sit out races simply because they're going to have less time at the factory throughout the course of the season to oversee the project and the development and all of those different aspects of the business. And he was hinting at the fact that even this year, he was seriously considering taking weeks out of the calendar to give him more of an opportunity to be at the factory and to oversee the operations there. And I thought that was an interesting takeaway. And it's something we'll be curious to see next year, whether some of these team principals sit out specific races strategically, just because if you're going to have a 23 calendar week, you're going to need to be able to buy time to be back at the factory. You can't be on the road for the entire calendar, because at that point you're looking really just after race operations. You're not looking after the development of the car. You're not looking after the development of the upcoming season. But I thought those were really, really interesting comments, and not something I've ever expected from a team principal. And to be fair, we've seen it in the past. But I think going into a calendar where we're going to have 23 races, if I'm a team principal or an executive, I simply can't be at every single race, because it means I'm neglecting my responsibilities with developing the car and overseeing the 500 or 600 or 800 people back at the factory, whether that's in Grove, or whether that's in Brackley or Milton Keynes or in Italy. I thought those were interesting comments.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Toto made some similar comments that it was time for him to sort of pull back, and he might not go to as many races. But the fact that the calendar is getting bigger makes me kind of wonder exactly when. I think that's a very astute observation that you made. That perhaps now that we're going to be seeing that these 20+ seasons, race seasons, going up to maybe as many as 25 is what they've been stating that's where they want to go, that maybe that the team principal becomes this all this sort of this umbrella overarching sort of supervisory kind of role, that they're not going to be on the pit wall each and every weekend, and maybe we'll see something more along the lines of a sporting director or a racing director that's
exactly
pit wall more of the time than maybe the team principal is not in there all the time, because I mean, like you say, I mean, they have several hundred people to to supervise and oversee, and not just the race this weekend, but you got the race next week, you've got the new car that's coming out for next year, got new engines being developed for 2026, whatever it is. So it's really going to be interesting to see how that goes. Anyways, time for another break here on the Overtime Media Network. Don't go away. We're going to talk about Mercedes after the break. So if you want to hang around for that, we'll be back in just a moment. All right. Well, welcome back to the show. So here we go. Let's talk about Mercedes. So like mentioned, Lewis fortunately tested negative for COVID this week. So he's been holed up in his hotel or his motorhome or wherever it is for the past week or so. So glad to hear that he's back and feeling good and testing negative for all that. Now, this I thought was interesting too. Valtteri Bottas said that he needs to be better after his recent run of form in Formula One. And well, yes, obviously, but I can't help feel like this is almost a bit of a recycled statement. It feels like very similar to the things that he was saying after 2018, which was a bit of a, not a great season for him. I don't think he won any races that year, and he had all sorts of issues. And then, he takes that winter off, comes back. And let's be fair, I mean, he nailed that 2019 Australian Grand Prix. I mean, he looked really, really good. I mean, to come out and just throw it down like that and beat his teammate and convincingly do so, I think made everybody kind of sit back and think maybe this is a new Valtteri Bottas. And I mean, he had a decent year, but I mean, he has his good races here and there, but it just is not something that he can extend over the entire course of a season. And this year, I really feel that there's been too many slips and little incidents like that. I mean, he did not, I mean, if you didn't know any better, if you took the numbers off of those cars and gave those drivers identical helmets last weekend, and you looked at that start at the Sakir Grand Prix, would you have known which one was Valtteri Bottas and which one was George Russell? You would have made the assumption, if there was no identifying features, that the guy that was kind of tentatively kind of hanging on through the first couple of corners and dropping back behind his teammates was the guy that had only just come up from the from their partner team from Williams. So there's a guy that crashed his car behind the safety car at Imola a couple of weeks ago. The guy that's only been in Formula One for a couple of years, kind of second season, but it was completely the opposite. It was the youngster George Russell that was so impressive. And again, it was Valtteri Bottas that there's been several incidents and starts like that. I mean, you look at Hungary for one. I mean, there's been a number of examples this year alone where it just seems for whatever reason that the moment kind of gets to him. I don't know if it's the pressure or what. I'm really not sure what's going on with him.
There was a photo that was taken of Bottas moments after he removed his helmet after the second race in Bahrain, and he's flush and his hair is disheveled and it hasn't shaved in a week. He looks exhausted, and I felt terrible for the guy because this specific photo made the rounds in the media, and there were a ton of stories about Bottas last week simply because it was such an easy comparison to draw between his performance and Russell's performance, and every single one of these stories was headlined by this photo of this exhausted looking disheveled Bottas. And I actually felt pretty bad for the guy because I'm sure that emotionally he may actually feel a little bit like that. And you're right, he made some comments this week that really spoke to where he maybe is emotionally right now. He acknowledges that ultimately anything less than P2 in the driver's standings is an absolute disgrace given the quality of the car that he's being given. But the problem is he's only 16 points ahead of of Max. And Max has had 5 DNFs this year. And you think all things being equal, maybe he wouldn't even be second. And to your point, you look back at 2018, he didn't win a race. He finished 5th in the championship behind Vettel and Raikkonen and Max and Lewis. Like, that was a tough season. And then I think we saw a glimmer at the beginning of 2019, just like you spoke. He had that phenomenal performance in Australia, and the media began labeling like, hey, is this the V2 Bottas? Is this Valtteri Bottas 2.0? Is this what he can do on a week in and week out basis? And, he and Hamilton had a torrid start to 2019, and they went 1-2, and I think the first 5 or 6 races. I should know this off the top of my head, but they looked really good. But even as
they dominated all the way up the Austrian Grand Prix, and it was only that was the race where they it was basically it was Max and Charles fighting for it, where Max famously barged his way past Charles to win that race, and Mercedes just didn't have the pace. But like you say, they completely flew off those first 7-8 races of the year. I mean, they were just so dominant. Like, well, I mean, they're usually dominant, but even more so.
I couldn't agree. I couldn't agree more. I just think this year hasn't been, so he's P2, but when you really factor in the balance of the calendar and how close Max is and how many DNFs Max has had this year, I don't think he's content with this performance. I don't know that Mercedes is going to admit outwardly that they're not content. They're going to wrap up the constructors. Well, they have wrapped up the constructor, but I think it would be a real black mark on the season for Mercedes if they don't tie up P1 and P2. And I feel bad for Bottas because I think emotionally he's in this tough position, but on the other hand, he's an established driver who's blessed with leaps and bounds, the best car the sport has maybe ever seen, just in terms of reliability, in terms of performance, in terms of aerodynamics, all those kind of pieces. He's blessed with a phenomenal car. So as much as sometimes I feel a little bit bad for him that he's emotionally down and it can be a challenge to be compared week in and week out against Lewis Hamilton, I still struggle to think that he's done enough to retain the seat. And ultimately, maybe Mercedes does retain him because it's the right thing to do to provide balance to that organization with Lewis. But I just, and you made that point as well. And we talked about this last week. It takes something little that really, and it sounds cliche, but to really throw him off his game. And you know what? Maybe it's a shunt, maybe it's a bad corner, maybe it's a lockup, maybe it's a bad free practice, but his entire weekend can be gone. And I was happy for him that he managed to out-qualify Russell last weekend, because I would have felt terrible if Russell had out-qualified him. But even then, he was only 0.2 of a second ahead of him. But I was sitting there with my wife watching that race, and we're like, you know what? I'm not confident he's going to hold the lead for the first lap. And he didn't hold it until the first corner. Like, I think psychologically, emotionally, I don't want to say he's broken, but I don't know that he's in a state where you can repair him at this point.
Well, that's the thing too. Like, I mean, we all know how quick Lewis is, right? Like, over the course of a lap, I mean, there's nobody faster, right? But the thing is too, and this is, I think, a large, I know for a fact, because I remember the quote at the time, after Nico Rosberg retired back in 2016, was just the fact that, the emotional drain that it is to go, head to head with Lewis Hamilton each and every week is just something that's just way too intense. And that's the thing, is that Lewis, like, upstairs, he is just so focused and so solid. I mean, he's just so intense. I think it was really interesting. If you go back, watch season 2 of Drive to Survive on Netflix, if you go back and you watch the one that covers the weekend at Hockenheim, I mean, that was a fantastic Grand Prix because it was wet, everybody was going off. And you see afterwards, you see it's in the motorhome, or it's wherever it is in the garage. Lewis is in his street clothes. He's talking to Toto, and he's so upset because he went off, and he had his incident, and just he was just still so intense and frustrated about it, even all those hours after the race. And he's just like, oh, man, I'm so sorry. And Toto's, like, you can tell too just how much it bothers him. And, regardless of the fact that, it was tricky conditions to drive in, he wasn't the only guy to go off the track on that race. I mean, I think basically everybody did at one point or another. But I mean, the point is, we don't see under normal circumstances Lewis Hamilton make too many mistakes. I mean, Sebastian Vettel at this point in his career, when he gets into like a very close duel and he's dicing for position with somebody else, there's always going to be that little nagging thought in the back of your head that, yeah, this is not going to end well for Seb. It is probably not going to end well for the other driver, just based on his past history over the past couple of years. When the thing is that when you see Lewis, you don't really have those same sort of questions, right? When it comes to his mental game, you just know he's dialed in, and it's a very difficult thing. And I think that perhaps maybe at the risk of oversimplifying it, is perhaps the situation and perhaps the pressure of being in the Mercedes and having a car that can win races all the time. Maybe that's it got into his head a little bit, because I mean, like, just back to your point about the start at Sakir last weekend, you had Bottas on pole. He was on the clean side of the circuit, and yet his teammate and I mean, it was blowing, it was windy before the start of that race. You could see the sand on the track. The commentators remarked before that there was sand blowing everywhere. But despite all that happening, George still had a good start. He went into that first corner. I mean, it wasn't a dodgy or questionable move. It was aggressive, but he picked his line, he held it, and he pushed his way through. And then he was off. I mean, he'd probably had at least a second, if not a second and a half lead by the time that lap was over, because whereas he got past his teammates, I mean, he's, Valtteri's trying to hold it on. And then he's got that squabble between Verstappen, Checo, and Charles, going on all around him there. So it's an interesting situation. I see the picture. You just sent me that picture of Valtteri. We should meme that up. We should put that
definitely.
We should get that one. Get the nice professionally produced one from like the Mercedes press kit. It's just like and meme it up. It's like 2020, how it started, how it's going now.
Totally.
that would be a good one. That's a job for somebody out there. But anyway, so just going back to Charles, or sorry, not to Charles, but to George. He's actually kind of dismissed the remarks that he made after Sakir last weekend about giving Toto Wolff a headache about regarding his driver's lineup for 2022 or maybe sooner, I think was the little extra nudge that he put in there. But George has actually said that he's going to be racing for Williams in 2021. And honestly, I think, just to build on your point just now, that Bottas, I think, has done enough, obviously, at this point to keep that seat. I mean, he's the perfect guy to partner with Lewis right now. I mean, and for Mercedes, he's not going to push Lewis all the time in the way that Rosberg did, where it got really nasty and like all the, the huge list of comings together that they had, like at Spa and Austria, Spain, and go on and on and on. I mean, he's going to get there. He's going to get the points. He's going to win some races here and there, but he's not going to rock the boat too much. But
and just on that, the only thing I would add is let's not kid ourselves. Hamilton was deeply integrated in the decision making about bringing Bottas over for the 2017 season. Like, let's not kid ourselves, especially after the kind of the psychological battle that was the 2014, 15, 16 seasons between Rosberg and Hamilton. And ultimately, I think if given a choice, Hamilton would probably still take Bottas for 2021. He's a known quantity. He's somebody that Hamilton's comfortable with. He's good enough that they're going to be able to secure the constructors. And he gives Hamilton enough space, both psychologically, emotionally, and physically on the track, that he allows Hamilton to focus on his racecraft without having to worry about what's happening with the engineers and with the mechanics and what's happening in the garage and what kind of conversations are happening with Wolff in the office. Like, all those kind of pieces kind of evaporate. So I think ultimately Hamilton still absolutely has a say. And I think Bottas would be his preference. And I think for Mercedes, you know what? Winning the driver's title is probably as important as winning the constructors, and the two go hand in hand with Hamilton. So I think you're right. I think Bottas will be back next year. And I think it would be disruptive to the chemistry of the whole if they brought in Russell now. And I think Hamilton, as much as anybody, probably would not be content with that decision making, because I think Russell would come in with the expectation that, hey, I want to be able to compete for races. And I think that could create some friction with Hamilton that wouldn't necessarily be there if Bottas was in the second seat. So my sense is you're absolutely right. It'll be Bottas next season. But I just want to make sure from a listener perspective that we appreciate that Hamilton has a very significant say in who his teammate is.
Yeah, and I think ultimately that to say, or his input might be, I don't want to see devalued at all, but I think that it might take a different sort of light depending on what happens with his contract discussions, over the next weeks and months.
Yeah.
So I mean, at some point, the team's going to step in and say, okay, that's great. You might want, Bottas as your teammate, but we have to start looking towards the future, because you've said to us that that this is going to be your last contract, that you're going to retire in 2 years or something. I mean, Lewis, like we've said before, he's earned his right to decide when he wants to walk away from Formula One. But at some point, whether or not they have some dates, in mind between Lewis Hamilton and Mercedes, he's at that point in his career now that despite, he signs a new career or contract now, maybe signs another one in 2 years. Who knows? I mean, only Lewis knows how long he wants to go on racing in Formula One. But at some point, the team's going to have to say, okay, well, that's great, but we really have to start looking towards the future and towards the guy that's going to pick it up and take this team forward after you decide that you've decided to call it a day and move away from the sport and move into other things. Anyways, I just want to take one final break here on the Overtime Media Network. Don't go away. We'll be back in just a moment. All right. Well, welcome back to the show. And well, we're almost an hour into this thing. We've talked about Mercedes. We've talked about Lewis Hamilton. We've talked about George Russell. We've talked about Ferrari. We've talked a whole lot of things. we still have a race going on this weekend, Mark. And you've actually been to Abu Dhabi, have you not?
Yeah, I'm so glad you bring this up, because I look for any opportunity to talk about my experiences at Yas Marina. I think, and you've been really, really privileged as well, that you've been able to travel around Western Europe and you've been able to see some of these really traditional tracks and experience some F1 races. And for me, the best way to sum up a race at some of these traditional British tracks, some of these Western European tracks, is it's very much a cross between a concert, a festival, a barbecue. It's all of those things kind of meshed together, and it creates this really lively, unpredictable, kind of inclusive, fun, exciting environment. There's people camping and barbecuing and drinking, and people are having beers at 10 in the morning, and you've got the cars going, and it's hot, like it's sticky or it's cold and it's raining. It's this really cool experience. And I think the closest thing that I can sum it up to would be like going to a music festival. Mm-hmm. And it's your favorite band that's playing, and everyone's there for the same reason, and everybody's having fun. And maybe the surroundings aren't comfortable, and maybe it's a little bit dusty, and maybe the parking was a disaster, and all that kind of stuff. But you're all there for the same reason, and it's really fun. Yas Marina's a little bit different. And I think it's different in a couple of ways. So to give everyone a little bit of context, Yas Marina is just north of Abu Dhabi, a part of the United Arab Emirates. It's about an hour and a half south of Dubai. It's a track that was built in the late 2000s. From a racing spectacle perspective, it's not a good track. I'll be honest. It doesn't make for good racing. It doesn't make for good overtaking. There's no elevation. It's completely flat. But I think what's really unique about it is that as a fan going there, one, the crowd size is much, much smaller. So if you go to Hockenheim, or you go to Monza, or you go to Silverstone, there could be 100 or 150,000 people there on race day. There could be 300,000 people walking through the gates over the course of the weekend. Mm-hmm. Yas is a little bit different. It sits 60,000 people. All of the grandstands are highly compartmentalized. So when you go into a traditional European track, you walk in the gates and you can go anywhere. You can circle the track, you can visit the grandstands, you can go to the F1 village, all those kind of pieces. When you go to Yas, it's highly compartmentalized and it's incredibly sterile. So sterile, for instance, that if you sit in the grandstands, you can't bring food or drink with you. You have to consume your food or drink outside of the grandstands. Security, naturally, given the part of the world, is incredibly strict. But a couple of the things that I really do like about it is the race is one of the only races, or I think possibly the only race that happens at dusk. So Bahrain is a night race. Singapore is a night race. The race at Abu Dhabi starts at dusk and the race transgresses into a night race. So from a mood perspective, it's kind of cool. But in terms of fan atmosphere and things like that, it's incredibly, the best way to put it is it's incredibly sterile. It's not a fun environment to be in. It's neat and you can be close to the drivers. And because the crowd size is so small, the drivers are much, much more accessible than they would be at other tracks. You know, if you go on Thursday, you do the paddock walk, you can get within feet of the drivers. Again, unlike these European events where maybe it's 150,000 people, you can get really close to the drivers. And I've shared this story before as well, that on the first Thursday there, the first year we went, we actually spent the better part of a day sitting in a line under a tent, waiting for the opportunity to meet the Mercedes drivers. And fortunately, my wife was able to meet Lewis. We got some stuff signed, super exciting. The next day, I basically bumped into Lewis outside of the grandstand. So it was kind of this experience that you probably wouldn't have anywhere else because the crowd size is smaller, because the security is so tight. The drivers are much more accessible, which is one of the really unique things about it. But in terms of atmosphere, it's really lame. It is in a cool place. So Yas Marina is on Yas Island, a man-made entertainment mecca, just north of Abu Dhabi. There's a massive shopping mall there. Ferrari World's there, which is a world-renowned theme park known for its really extreme roller coasters. Warner Brothers World is there. There's water parks. So from a family entertainment perspective, there's lots you can do there, but the atmosphere is different, and it's a very, very sterile environment. So that's kind of the way I would sum it up. Still worth doing, and I would love to go back again, but it's very, very different than a traditional F1 event.
Yeah, it's very different. My first race, and I've talked about it on the show before, was the 2001 European Grand Prix at the Nürburgring.
Oh wow!
And that was awesome because that is just sort of like the beginning of kind of like peak Schumacher, right?
Wow.
And we were staying because like Nürburg is actually just a little tiny town in the middle of the in the mountains there, right? And then so we were actually staying, you know, and it's not really close because we were staying up in Bonn, which is northeast of where the Nürburgring is. So you go down the A61, the Autobahn, and then you could basically turn off onto a country road. It's a 2-lane road. And then, you know, like I have the number 110,000 people there for race day, and it was packed, and it was
wow.
I mean, the atmosphere was absolutely fantastic. And we were sitting down at the bottom. They used to call it the Dunlop curve. I don't know what they call it now, but it's the big hairpin at the bottom. So we were parked on the east side of the track. So we had to walk all the way in. But like you say, we went in through the main gates on the like the village side of the track, which I guess would be on the sort of the northeast side. We walked all the way around, but where you could sit was great because, you know, we saw the cars coming down the hill into the hairpin, then up into that very fast left-hander. And, you know, you could just like, you could say you could walk in. I mean, this is 20 years ago. This is kind of pre 9/11 and all the security things and pre all these modern tracks and things like that. But it's also different too, because we were at Barcelona a couple of years ago as well. And although our tickets were only valid for one grandstand, which was just across from the pit exit, I mean, there is like a nice variation in the terrain at Montmello there. Because, you know, they actually, when they come out of the pits, that start finish, it kind of, there's a bit of like a bit of an arc to it, and you get to start finish and it drops down a little bit until you get into the turn 1 and 2, then back up and around. And then where we're actually sitting, because the track actually, if you look at the map of it, you can see we're kind of, you know, it sort of folds back in on itself. So we could see the cars, they disappear through turns 1, 2, and 3, and then they come back around, and we could see them in the infield there, and then they go back around. So it was a pretty good place to go. But, you know, Abu Dhabi is one of these places, just from an experience point of view, I'd very much like to go to at one of these, one of these points in the future when travel becomes
totally
a reasonable option.
And I would still highly, highly recommend it. It's very different from an atmosphere perspective to a traditional F1 race. The one thing I would add as well is that for any Canadian tourists that head over there, you will be shocked at the number of Tim Hortons restaurants in that country. They are everywhere, I promise you.
That's amazing. That's something I never expected to hear. But, you know, just I was looking at some of the stats here. Again, it's a fairly long circuit. I mean, I don't think we adequately give it or at least maybe I don't appreciate the length of the Yas Marina Circuit. It's 5.55 kilometers, or just under 3.5 miles, 21 turns, and fastest, or the race lap record was set last year by Lewis, a 139.283. So that's a pretty decent lap. I mean, compared to what we saw at Sakir last weekend, where we're like 55 seconds or whatever it was. It just very, very different. But it's like I was saying at the very top of the show, I'm not really ready for the season to end, because that the season is well and truly over, because as soon as these cars finish, pass, start, finish, that's when the donuts happen, and all of a sudden it's like, I can kind of put a bit of abuse into this car, because I don't have to worry about destroying anything, because this is going into a museum, or it's going to
I just have to add to that. So when my wife and I went to Abu Dhabi the first time, it was the conclusion of the 2016 championship. So it came down to Lewis and Nico. So we were in the main grandstand, and we were immediately parallel to the first two grid slots. So Hamilton had qualified on pole. Nico was right beside him, and they were no more than 20 or 30 feet in front of us. But what we also got as part of our package was we got the podium pass. So we were actually able to go down and watch the podium celebration itself from the track. So with probably 1 or 2 laps left, we were like super excited. Let's go down there. Let's line up so we can get out there. What we didn't realize was that in doing so, we would miss the donuts that would have taken place 10 feet in front of us. So we actually missed the celebration of Nico hopping out of his car, and we missed it all because we were sitting behind a fence waiting to be let onto the track to watch the podium celebration. And I've been angry at myself ever since, because I'm also a big photographer, and I would have been able to get some great photos. But I know for next time that we will wait until after the donuts before we proceed down to the celebration at the podium.
Lesson learned the hard way, eh?
Very much so.
But you know what else is going to be interesting this weekend is there's a number of things that are still in play. Third place in the Constructors' Championship. I mean, that three-way battle between McLaren, Racing Point, and Renault. I mean, that's kind of opened and closed a little bit. I mean, Racing Point looks pretty good to take third in the championship at the moment. And then, of course, we have this this battle with Max and Valtteri Bottas. That's still something that could switch around. And like you were saying just now, I think that if Bottas doesn't manage to seal this one up, I mean, he hasn't been on the podium now in 4 races since Imola. Oof. And all those DNFs. I mean, Max didn't even make a single lap last weekend at Sakir. So, I mean, if he manages to come and better Valtteri and close, and, I mean, it's possible. I mean, it is a fairly sizable gap. I mean, it's not going to be simple. I mean, Max is obviously going to need a very, very good result, and Valtteri is going to need a very, very bad one. But, it is a possibility, and it's not like one of these sort of mathematical possibilities like like we had going into Turkey, where Bottas still theoretically could win the championship, but it's only think, well, Lewis would have to miss all the remaining races and Valtteri would have to win all the races. I mean, it could happen, but the likelihood would be not very probable. But so that obviously is one to watch. And like you were saying, that if he doesn't hold on to that would be a very disappointing. That would be a bit of blemish on the season for Mercedes. I don't think that's an overstatement at all.
Yeah, I think for me, that's probably going to be one of the bigger ones to watch this weekend. But I think as well, the battle between McLaren and Racing Point, it's probably closer than it should have been, given some of the bad luck and the misfortune that the Racing Point teams had this year, and the fact that they were deducted 15 points earlier in the season. But I think really for me, that the things that I'm going to tune in to watch this weekend is how does Max look? Is he able to bounce back? Is he able to qualify well? Is he potentially able to squeak out that second place from Bottas, and potentially what does that do with Bottas long term? But I also think it would be an unbelievable achievement for Racing Point to finish third in the championship. And again, that's largely facilitated because Ferrari's had such an atrocious season. But for Lawrence Stroll and that consortium to be able to come in and say, hey, in our second full season, we were able to surge to third in the championship, and we're only just getting started. The factory's under construction. They're going through a massive hiring campaign. Their principal driver for next season, Sebastian Vettel hasn't even donned a racing suit for this team. Like, there's so many good things in motion for that team that if they were able to finish third, and the other benefit too is just from a cash injection perspective, to finish third into the championship and take cash and to be able to reinvest it in the team, because I think that's one of the things that Lowell's really shown a willingness to do is he's invested significantly in this team. He's invested significantly in Aston Martin. To him, this is a point of pride, not a hobby. This is a business for him, and he wants to excel. And I think it's really exciting. And I think from a Canadian perspective as well, because so much of the money that's tied up in that team is Canadian, and they don't race under a Canadian license. But it is really cool that you see a Canadian maple leaf on the halos of those cars, and it's something that makes me grin every time I see it. And I'm really excited that there's the potential that they could secure third in the championship this weekend.
Yeah, it really is incredible. I mean, if you go back just a couple of years when they were, still Force India, I mean, they were literally, they were at death's door. I mean, that team was literally, it's probably not too much of an exaggeration, days, weeks away from folding and locking the doors and walking.
100%.
I mean, it was really, really that bad. So to go from where they were then to where they are now and where they're going to next year is absolutely incredible. And that's why, I feel bad for Sergio Perez, because I mean, he was, just where he was and, what he's put into that team, and, how he helped to get the ball rolling to take get this team headed in that direction. It's a bit rough, I mean, that's just the unfairness that is professional sports. But, it's interesting. There's been a couple of things, just talking about Sergio Perez. And the first one, I think is interesting is Danny Ricciardo said that his rivals, so basically all the other 19 guys on the grid that were still, well, I guess except for the ones that crashed out on lap 1, should not have let Perez come back from being dead last at the end of lap 1 to winning that race. But I mean, he was just an unstoppable force. And it's interesting too, because I don't know if there's if we should read too much into this one, but the motorsport big boss at Red Bull, Helmut Marko, is one of the people that sent Checo a congratulatory message after his win last weekend at Sakir. And I know that his name has been linked with that second Red Bull seat for next year. And it seems to me that I know that they said that they're probably going to make a decision after the season, but it's hard to say. I mean, is that just because they just want to just finish up the season? Because it seems the way that it sort of drags on each and every day, to me, it kind of seems more like Albon will hang on to that seat. But as we talked about at length in one of the recent shows, that you get a guy like Checo Perez and put him in that second Red Bull, that's going to be a formidable team next year. I mean, he's a proven quantity as a driver. There's no doubt about it. I mean, he's had some very good moments in that Racing Point this year, and partner him up with Max Verstappen. I think that's a really, really good lineup. I mean, they've been in some rocky and troubled waters with that second driver with Gasly and Albon over the past couple of years after Ricciardo jumped ship and went over to Renault. But I mean, to get a guy like Perez into that team for next year, maybe 2 years, whatever it is, if they decide to go that way, I mean, that makes a very, very solid lineup for that team. So who knows? Like I say, we could be reading a little bit too much into that statement that Marco sent Checo Perez, a message congratulating him. But who knows? We'll wait and see. It might come out in the wash, as they say, over the next weeks and months ahead.
Yeah, I agree. I don't really think I have a lot to add other than the fact that I just think if Red Bull are serious about competing for a constructor's title, you need to do it with the two best available drivers. And I think Max is their present and their future. But if you have the opportunity to bring on a driver of the caliber of Sergio Perez, you have to do it. And not only does it improve their chances on the track, it's what it does for them off the track from a marketability perspective as well. You know what? Albon is a great kid. He's polite. He's charismatic. He's overcome some pretty unfortunate circumstances in his youth. He's overcome a lot of challenges in his own career, having been cut from the Red Bull program, having been resigned to going to Formula E, getting that last minute call up to what is now AlphaTauri. Like, he's been through a lot himself, but ultimately what Sergio Perez has been able to do this year and in the previous years, and to secure podiums with Sauber and Force India, to me, it's just, if I'm putting the best possible team on the grid, that team includes Sergio Perez. And I find it so baffling that a team that has been as quick to cut ties with drivers like Gasly midway through last season and with Kvyat midway through 2016, that they're so invested in Albon. And again, I'm glad they are. I'm glad they're actually making the effort to nurture one of their young drivers, which is what they ultimately need to do. And maybe they recognize they made a mistake with Gasly last year. But I just think from a purely business perspective, from a championship contention perspective, Sergio is your guy, and you cannot miss out on this opportunity.
Yeah, well, I'm going to throw another twist into that one here as we start to wrap it up. I mean, just from Honda's point of view, saying that they want to go all in next year, their last year in Formula One, that they want to do everything to help Red Bull win races next year and win the championship. I mean, if you're Honda, I mean, you know, you're sitting at the headquarters in Tokyo, you're probably making some phone calls or, you know, sending some messages as like, guys, get Sergio into that car for next year. We're going to give you like the best engine that we can. Let's, you know, let's try and stack the odds and, you know, in our favors as best we can. And no offense to Alex Albon, but I just see better things happening with them. With you have a lineup like Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez. I mean, I see Max doing really, really good things like he does. And I see Sergio, I just see a lot of, I see more positives. I don't see too many, you know, cons in that list there. I don't see very many negative points at all.
Yeah, and maybe from Honda's perspective too, that they could use a little bit of leverage. You know, you want this power unit IP. Well, I think for our last season, you need to do us a solid, and you need to give us the best possible driver lineup available. And I think it's accessible and it's within their reach. And if they don't do it, and Albon continues to perform at this level next year, I think from a Christian Horner Marco perspective, I don't think they would ever live this one down. I think it would be very, very, very hard. And I guess ultimately Red Bull doesn't have shareholders that they necessarily need to be accountable to. But I think from a corporate perspective and from a fan perspective, it would be very, very difficult to rationalize that decision, knowing that we haven't seen substantial growth in Albon. And I think that was part of it too, is, you know, maybe in the back half of the season, we would have seen significant growth. And ultimately, we haven't seen that. And his performance throughout the season has been flat. And I know he secured a podium in the first weekend in Bahrain, but really that was a byproduct of a catastrophic engine failure for Sergio Perez that robbed him of podium. But ultimately, I don't think we've seen that growth. And I think just from a business perspective, from a marketing perspective, you go on in Sergio Perez. You literally have nothing to lose in that equation.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, there's no doubt that we've seen like Albon show at times what he can do. I mean, that pass he made on Lando Norris last week in Sakir, that was one of those moments. But just pace-wise, week after week, you know, race after race, that gap between himself and Max Verstappen just seems, you know, a lot bigger than it should be. I mean, if these guys are driving identical cars, and of course, Max is kind of like one of those next level drivers that can just push these cars to the absolute limits of the envelope and beyond, and just get all the performance that he can, and even more out of it that he probably shouldn't be able to, but does.
Yeah.
I mean, that's obviously got a lot to do with it, but you know, still, I mean, Albon might not be able to push the car and get as much in terms of speed out of it as Max does, but that gap shouldn't be that big. So,
and that gap didn't exist when Daniel Ricciardo was there. I mean, it was a toss-up every single race weekend. And even after Max had migrated to the senior team, Daniel Ricciardo was still winning races, and they were fighting on the track. And ultimately, that may have been the downfall of that driver pairing. But ultimately, you didn't see this gigantic delta in performance between the two drivers. And I know the critique of Red Bull as well. The car's built for Max. Well, you know what? I don't buy that. They've had a year and a half to engineer a car for Albon, and an entire offseason plus a 4-month break between Australia and the beginning of the season. Like, they've had the opportunity to build a package that's comfortable for Albon to drive. And I think at this point, it's just his race pace. And I'm not suggesting he's not a capable driver, because you're right, his racecraft at times can be well, and he's had some bad luck, especially at the end of last season in Brazil and at the beginning of this season. But ultimately, like, the pace, the delta between him and Max is just unjustifiable from a development perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So who knows? Maybe they're just waiting to drop something, you know, substantial or big, you know, in the off season. Once the season is over and done, it's all wrapped up, and we're looking towards Australia, looking towards Melbourne, you know, several months down the road. So who knows? Honestly, I would be surprised if we get to Australia 3-4 months down the road, whatever it is, and it's still a lineup of Alex Albon and Max Verstappen at Red Bull. I'm just going to be completely open and upfront about that. So whether or not my hunch, turns out to be anything, or it's just, wishful thinking, that'll be proven or disproven in the months ahead. Wouldn't be the first time I'm wrong. So on that note, as we because that's basically all I got for tonight. I'm not going to let you off easy. So we've got one final race this weekend. Who are you picking for your podium?
Oh, you're asking?
Oh yeah, no, I'm not asking. I'm
Oh.
demanding. I'm demanding.
Oh, I look at the successes that Lewis has had there in the past. That said, he's coming off a week of illness and he's missed a race, which has never happened. So I don't know that he's necessarily going to have the same pace that he would necessarily have. Oh, there's so many stories. I'm going to go with Lewis just because it's the safe bet. Just because I don't want to be brave, I'm just going to go with the safe bet. I got to hear yours. Your guess. Like, you wouldn't lead me down that path unless you had a controversial pick. I need to know who your pick's going to be.
No, well, I'm going with Lewis, but I'm going to go. He's either going to be really, really hot because he's had this week of extra week off. Regardless, I know he wasn't feeling the greatest. So I'm either going to be thinking he's on his game because he had the week off to rest, or he's going to be off his game because he's still recovering from his mild COVID, and he's still getting back into it despite the negative test and everything like that. But having said that, I still expect him to win. But I'm saying that Max comes home second, Valtteri Bottas third. I think that Bottas still takes second in the championship. I think Max beats him head to head on the track, just as a bit of a little bit of a reminder. You might have finished ahead of me in the championship, but had I not had all those DNFs, I would be second in the championship. That's what I think it's going to be. So we'll talk about this on Sunday night when we wrap it up. How close. I mean, we could have a completely bizarre circumstance at the it's something. I mean, it's been a weird year.
I hope we do. It would give us a lot to talk about.
It would. But that's why I'm going Lewis, Max, Valtteri as our podium. So there it is. Anyways, that's all I got. I think that's all we got for the both of us. So we're going to wrap it up right there. Thank you all very much for downloading and listening to the show. Thank you for watching on YouTube. If you like watching the show on YouTube, hit that red sub button. You won't miss a show every time we post one. If you guys want to get in touch, regardless if you're watching the video or if you're listening to the podcast, the contact is the same for either way. Regardless, Twitter at Scuderia F1 Pod or email scuderiaf1podcast@gmail.com. And that's it. On behalf of myself and my friend and co-host, Mark Hamilton, that's a wrap. We'll be back on Sunday night. Have a great weekend. Enjoy the race. And that's it for now. Bye for now.